Formula 1 is a cutthroat business, no doubt about it. Drivers are expected to perform or else they're out. Unfortunately, for said drivers, some of them are treated badly due to political or financial reasons. Sometimes a team boss just doesn't like the driver anymore. In this video, we'll go over 5 situations where teams were horrible to their drivers. I'm getting help in this video from the man with the biggest catalogue of historical Formula 1 knowledge, Peter Brook. Number 5. Guido van der Garde. Or, if you're not Dutch, Guido van der Garde. Dutch F1 driver Guido van der Garde was a reserve driver in 2014 after securing a sponsor deal when he was told he was fired. Then, things got really messy. Peter, what can you tell us about what happened next?
Well, Wim, after a year's experience racing for Caterham, van der Garde was active in his role as Sauber's test and reserve driver in 2014, driving in FP1 7 times. He was primed to get a race seat in 2015, but instead, in November 2014, it was announced that Sauber had signed rookie Felipe Nasr and van der Garde's successor at Caterham, Marcus Ericsson. At this point, van der Garde spoke out and said he had been told in June he would have a race seat in 2015, only to be then told after this announcement by Sauber CEO Monisha Kaltenborn that he was no longer needed. So in December, he filed an international arbitration complaint with the Swiss Chambers Arbitration Institution. This became public in early March 2015, less than 2 weeks before the season-opening Australian Grand Prix, and initially the SCAI took van der Garde's side and ordered Sauber to honour the terms of the original agreement. 3 days later, van der Garde then filed an application with the Supreme Court of Victoria in Australia to enforce this and entitle him to race in Melbourne. The following week, his application was granted, 2 days before Friday practice would begin. Sauber immediately appealed, claiming the FIA Contract Recognition Board had approved their termination of his contract the previous month, and that he couldn't drive either car anyway as they had both been moulded and tailored to Nasr and Ericsson, who had also done all the testing in them. This, however, was rejected by the Victorian Court of Appeal, and Nasr and Ericsson were forced to miss FP1 after van der Garde accused Kaltenborn of contempt of court, threatening to have their assets seized if they did not allow him to race. Bernie Ecclestone's interventions allowed Nasr and Ericsson to participate in FP2, and on Saturday, van der Garde ceased any attempts to race that weekend, allowing Nasr and Ericsson to do so, and 4 days later, he and Sauber reached an agreement whereby van der Garde had his contract terminated once and for all in exchange for an estimated $16 million in compensation. Despite that, he continued to sling mud at Sauber, which they ignored, and he was never again contracted with any other Formula 1 teams.
Oof, that's nasty. But at least they paid up. Number 4. Thierry Boutsen. The Belgian race winner drove for Williams in 1990 when they persuaded Nigel Mansell to join them next year. When Boutsen returned to the garage after winning the Hungarian Grand Prix, he didn't get the welcome he expected. What was going on there, Peter?
Thierry Boutsen signed a 2-year contract with Williams for 1989 as a replacement for Nigel Mansell. He was narrowly outscored by teammate Riccardo Patrese in 1989, but got 2 wins to Patrese's 0. In 1990, Patrese took a win early on, but Boutsen was more consistent, and going into the Hungarian Grand Prix, he had 18 points to Patrese's 12. In Hungary, Boutsen took his first pole position, and Williams' first pole since Patrese's there the previous year, and then took the win, just about holding off Ayet and Senna. Despite this triumph, certainly the best Grand Prix weekend of his career, it was received relatively coldly by the Williams garage, as Frank Williams was beginning to realise that if he wanted to properly challenge McLaren and Ferrari for championships, they needed a cutthroat driver, as opposed to the more conservative driving styles of Boutsen and Patrese. Despite the fact that at the end of 1990 Boutsen had scored 34 points to Patrese's 23 and had never finished outside the points, he was dropped and Mansell was brought back and Boutsen ended up at Ligier. Over the next 2 seasons he scored just 2 points, whereas Mansell and Patrese got 17 wins between them and Mansell stormed to the title in 1992. Boutsen then spent half a year in an ill-fitting Jordan before getting dropped and retiring altogether.
Oh dear, imagine that. Winning a race and nobody being happy for you. Really mean. Number 3. Mick Schumacher. The son of legendary world champion Michael Schumacher is currently reserve driver for Mercedes. His 2-year stint at Haas didn't do his career much good, and the way he was treated by Günther Steiner didn't do his confidence much good. Can you tell us all what happened with Mick during his period with Haas, Peter?
Mick Schumacher is a driver who has had to bear the weight of the world on his shoulders, being the nephew of Ralf Schumacher and all. This started with him racing in karting under his mother's maiden name of Betch in order to avoid drawing attention to himself. The hype train began when he started winning races in European Formula 3 in 2018, and when he won this title and then the Formula 2 title in 2020, it was inevitable he would end up in Formula 1, and end up in Formula 1 he did, with Haas. His rookie season was a relatively dull one as the car was desperately uncompetitive and his teammate Nikita Mazepin was pulling in all the negative press attention like a black hole. Schumacher resoundingly beat Mazepin on track, but otherwise had little else to do with any other drivers, aside from a small and futile battle with Max Verstappen in Hungary. However, he did gain a reputation as a crasher, doing so at Imola, Monaco, Paul Ricard, the Hungaroring and Jeddah. He ended the season as the most expensive driver on the grid, having caused €4.2 million in repair costs. He retained his seat in 2022, and Mazepin did initially until the war in Ukraine broke out, and so Schumacher was joined by the returning Kevin Magnussen. This would give him more of a challenge and more of a chance to prove himself, as Magnussen was an experienced veteran and Haas could only go up. As hoped, the car was better, and at the first round Magnussen qualified 7th and finished 5th, and Schumacher qualified 12th but finished 11th after getting spun round by Esteban Ocon, who had also taken him out on the opening lap in Mexico the previous year. At Jeddah, he crashed again, this time in qualifying and sat out the race. In Miami, he was set to score his first points, until he collided with mentor and surrogate father figure Sebastian Vettel with 3 laps to go and finished 15th. As with the previous year, he crashed again at Monaco, this time in the race, and managed to split the car in half. At this point, the pressure was beginning to mount as he had 0 points to Magnussen's 15, and Magnussen had a clean sheet aside from a first-lap collision with Lewis Hamilton in Barcelona. Here, however, Schumacher began turning things around, making Q3 in Canada and then climbing from 19th to 8th at Silverstone, scoring his first points. And in Austria, he qualified 7th and put in a very dogged performance in the sprint race, eventually finishing 9th after a close battle with Hamilton and then finished 6th in the main race. Beyond this, there were no further retirements, but also no further points, and he did crash again at Suzuka, this time on a slow lap on his way back to the pit lane, and he was once again the most expensive driver of the year, with $2 million in damages. The numerous crashes over these 2 years had hindered car development for Haas, and meant they were running short of spare parts, and so at the end of the year Schumacher was dropped and replaced with Nico Hülkenberg. Schumacher had been part of the Ferrari Driver Academy since January 2019 and a Ferrari reserve driver since 2021, but was dropped by them as well, leaving him as a free agent. He got picked up, however, by Mercedes and is currently their test and reserve driver. Toto Wolff has made a point of giving him a prominent and proactive role within the team and came to his defence after the publication of Steiner's book Surviving to Drive, A Year Inside Formula 1, in which Steiner went into detail about the ramifications of Schumacher's crashes, and Wolff claimed, along with Ralph, that had Michael been in the paddock in those 2 years, Steiner would have been much nicer to him. More recently, Wolff has tried to secure a deal with Williams to get Schumacher back in a race seat if rookie Logan Sargent fails to improve his form, but this has been shut down by Williams team principal and former Mercedes Motorsport strategy director James Fowles, but Schumacher is primed to race for Mercedes if Hamilton or Russell are unable to do so. Wolff clearly feels an obligation of duty to Mick, most likely out of loyalty to his father.
It seems it's not always fun with Günther Steiner. Number 2. Felipe Nasser. Brazilian driver Felipe Nasser was in the unfortunate position to be teamed up with Marcus Ericsson, who was a lesser driver, but since his sponsor kept the team afloat, he received preferential treatment. Is that right, Peter? Is that what happened in 2016?
Felipe Nasser may have got a seat in Formula 1 at the behest of Guido van der Garde, but that didn't mean he couldn't also be chewed up and spat out by Sauber. He joined Sauber in 2015 alongside Marcus Ericsson, who already had a year's experience of Caterham. As part of his signing, the team took on a new livery courtesy of Nasser's sponsors Banco do Brasil. Nasser finished an impressive 5th on his debut and had a generally strong season where he scored 27 points to Ericsson's 9, won the race battle 8-5 and won the qualifying battle 10-9. Both drivers retained their seats for 2016. The 2016 car, however, was far worse than 2015, and they drifted to the back of the grid, mostly fighting against Manor. As well as this, Nasser found himself being consistently outperformed by Ericsson. It wasn't until the 8th round at Baku that he managed to beat him, and the team were then thrown into crisis after Pascal Wehrlein of Manor scored a point in Austria and left Sauber as the only pointless team. 2 rounds later, team founder Peter Sauber and team principal Manisha Kaltenborn sold their shares in the team to Longbow Finance, whose owners were Swedish and had been backing Ericsson, which secured the team's future after having prolonged financial difficulties. The 2 drivers continued to finish outside the points until the penultimate round at Interlagos, Nasser's home race, where in the pouring rain he managed to finish 9th, scoring 2 points and securing them the critical 10th place in the Constructors' Championship. When the season was over, it was announced that Nasser and Wehrlein would be swapping seats for 2017. However, Nasser had inadvertently dug his own grave, as by single-handedly securing 10th in the Constructors' Championship for Sauber and the prize money that follows, he had denied this to Manor, who had always been short of money ever since their first iteration as Virgin in 2010, and so during the winter break they went into administration, leaving Nasser without a drive. After Nasser failed in his attempts to find a seat with another team and lost the backing of Banco do Brasil, he then claimed that when Longbow Finance started getting involved in Sauber at the start of 2016, they were so heavily invested in Ericsson that he was being given upgrades first, and they had even tampered with Nasser's suspension and assigned an inexperienced mechanic to his car that wrongly adjusted the tyre pressures. In the early part of the season, Nasser was adamant his car was different from Ericsson's. There were some surprisingly large gaps between them in qualifying, and across the year Ericsson won that battle 12-7 and won the race battle 9-4. He did, though, crash into Nasser at Monaco, crashed in FP1 at Silverstone and missed qualifying, and crashed again at Interlagos. After Longbow Finance's takeover, Manisha Kaltenborn, who had stayed on as team principal, started being much colder to Nasser, and even after Interlagos said it didn't matter what he'd done, Ericsson was staying for 2017. Nasser hasn't raced in Formula 1 since, but Ericsson stayed for another 2 years, rather curiously steeing off Wehrlein in similarly suspicious circumstances in 2017, but then getting walked over by Charles Leclerc in 2018.
Wow, I hear about sabotage all the time. But these things really happened? Number 1. Nelson Piquet Jr. Another Brazilian driver and brother-in-law of Max Verstappen had it worse than anyone when he drove for Renault, with Fernando Alonso and in a team led by Uber villain Flavio Briatore. You won't believe what that poor bloke had to do to keep his seat. Would you be so kind to fill us in, Peter?
Nelson Piquet Jr. is another driver to have carried high expectations by virtue of his name, as the son of a 3-time champion. He made his debut in 2008 as teammate to a 2-time champion in the form of Fernando Alonso. He was chosen for the seat precisely because he wasn't expected to challenge Alonso, but he was still expected to be dependable. Before he got his debut podium in Germany due to a lucky safety car, he had scored just 2 points and finished only 3 races, crashing out 5 times. The team had not been coy about hiding their dissatisfaction with his performances, and when the inaugural Singapore Grand Prix came about, he had scored 13 points to Alonso's 28. Piquet was eliminated in Q1, and Alonso was in Q2 after a fuel feed failure which prevented him setting a time, when it was expected he could make Q3. At this point, Renault team principal Flavio Briatore and Renault executive director of engineering Pat Simmons gave Piquet a dilemma: either deliberately crash in a way that triggers a safety car and gives track position to Alonso on a circuit it was believed it would be difficult to overtake on in order to give him the result they felt he deserved, or you will not be racing with us in 2009. Piquet chose the former, and after Alonso became the first driver to pit for fuel and tyres, Piquet then crashed at turn 17, where he had also spun on the formation lap, triggering a safety car. At this point, almost the entire grid pitted, and the closure of the pit lane at first forced some drivers to pit when it was closed in order to avoid running out of fuel and subsequently receive a penalty, and of course race leader Felipe Massa famously left his pit box with the fuel hose still attached. As Alonso was on heavier fuel than those now left in front of him, they all had to pit again after the race restarted, which gave him the lead and the win. True to their word, Renault did keep Piquet for 2009, but by the summer break, Alonso had 13 points, a pole position and a fastest lap, but Piquet had nothing at all, and so he was dropped. At this point, he decided to go public about what had happened in Singapore almost a year earlier. Attempts were made to have the race result overturned, which would have subsequently handed the driver's title away from Lewis Hamilton and towards Felipe Massa, which fell through as race results were set in stone following the FIA prize-giving ceremony, and Renault were given a 2-year suspended sentence for race fixing, and Briatore and Simmons were both forced to leave the team. At the time, Piquet said it was just the three of them in on the plan, as well as an unnamed Witness X, who attended the pre-race meeting where the plan was formulated but rejected it, which was how Renault avoided any further punishment, and Alonso avoided any punishment at all. But 15 years later, Bernie Ecclestone resurrected the story by revealing that himself and the late Max Mosley knew about the plan at the time, finding out from Nelson's father, but remained silent in order to avoid bringing the sport into disrepute and to avoid disrupting the very close title battle between Massa and Hamilton. His poor race results aside, Piquet had lost any chances of getting another seat in Formula 1, but did go on to become the inaugural Formula E champion.
It's no wonder he spilled the beans the next season. So that was 5 times a team was horrible to a driver. If you like this video, please give a thumbs up. If you have anything to add, leave a comment. And subscribe for more content like this. Thank you, Peter Brook. Take care now. Doei doei.